Picture this. You're standing knee-deep in the frozen, wind-howling snow of the 9th century Arctic Circle, right? Above you, the sky is the color of cold iron, and the wind is just doing its absolute best to sear through every single layer of wool and fur you've got on. We're talking about a cold you literally cannot negotiate with. In today's explainer, we're going to transport you back in time to step inside a world that somehow survived the brutal indifference of the North, and we're going to explore exactly how they pulled it off.
So think about it for a second. How do you survive a 9th century Arctic winter without a modern fireplace? It's kind of unimaginable to us today, right? But for the people living in this era, surviving the winter wasn't just, a daily chore or some temporary inconvenience. It was a brutal, months-long siege against the elements. Every calorie, every breath, every single log of wood, it was all a highly calculated move in a game of life and death.
When we think of historical strongholds, our minds usually jump straight to those grand stone castles with massive, roaring chimneys. But if you were looking across these snow-blasted hills back in the 9th century, you wouldn't see that. No way. You would just see this featureless white void, interrupted only by these low, wide structures that were actually partially buried right there in the drifts. They looked way less like grand houses, and honestly, more like overturned, buried canoes just hunkered down against the wind.
Section 1. The Architecture of Containment. Let's look at how they minimized heat loss.
Okay, let's dive into this. Imagine crouching down to step through a remarkably short door. I mean, a height deliberately designed to practically crush the spine of the unwary. That low clearance wasn't a mistake, though. Viking architecture wasn't designed to generate massive amounts of heat. Instead, it prioritized minimizing heat loss at all costs. And this brings us to this absolutely brilliant engineering concept we like to call the thermos in the snow. Instead of fighting the cold with massive raging fires, they engineered a structure to trap and protect every single precious calorie of warmth inside. The logic here is just fascinating. The outside layers of the structure would actually freeze as stiff as armor, which in turn effectively insulated and protected the vulnerable living interior from those howling winds outside.
So the absolutely crucial point here is exactly how they built these resilient walls. Their solution was this 5-layer system, often referred to as the dirt blanket. It started with heavy wooden frames, right? And then those were packed incredibly tight with turf, layered with straw, stuffed with moss, and finally the whole shebang was sealed with mud. This dirt sandwich functioned as a phenomenal, year-round natural insulation system. And get this, the sloped roof was even designed to hold literal tons of snow without collapsing. That essentially turned the winter snowfall itself into an extra blanket of insulation.
And this brilliantly illustrates a really fascinating Norse physics secret. Notice the contrast. Straight corners trap and dissipate heat, while curved walls actually circulate warmth. The Norse fundamentally understood that heat hates corners. Because of this, their longhouses completely abandoned sharp angles in favor of these circular, softened living zones. It kept the warmth moving in a continuous loop, physically wrapping around the inhabitants instead of just getting stuck and cooling off in the corners of the room.
Moving on to Section 2. Biomass heating and smoke. This is all about sharing the warmth.
Now, as we move into the center of the room, the atmosphere completely shifts. It's claustrophobic for sure, but it is undeniably warm. Take a deep breath and just imagine the heavy, thick scent of wood smoke mingling with the earthy musk of wet wool. You won't find any private bedrooms here. There are only shared living zones where every living soul contributes to the collective warmth of the building. It was a calculated trade-off. They made a very conscious choice. They would rather, quote, choke a little in the smoke than freeze in the clear air. You might be wondering, well, why not just build a chimney? Because they knew a modern chimney acts exactly like a giant vacuum. In the dead of the Arctic night, a chimney would just pull all your hard-earned heat right out through the roof. So they chose to live in a permanent twilight of lingering smoke.
Let's compare the two primary heat sources inside the longhouse. First, you've got the hearth right in the center. But it wasn't a roaring blaze. Actually, scratch that, it was mostly just a small, smoldering pit of dried peat used mainly for cooking soup. Interestingly enough, the thick, black velvet soot it created on the rafters, they scraped that off and mixed it with animal fat to make ink for their runes. But that small fire wasn't heating the house. The real, life-saving warmth, that came from the livestock pen.
At the far end of the longhouse, a dozen cows, sheep, and goats were just packed into the steamy room. Guys, this was literally the 9th century equivalent of central heating. The massive amount of biomass heat radiating from those animals raised the temperature of the entire structure. Families even slept on elevated platforms directly above the animals. It was basically the original heated floor, powered entirely by the breath and bodies of the herd right below them.
Section 3. The Fire of the Mind. The Deep Rhythms of Survival.
Let's see how this physical survival builds into their psychology. In this timeless, sunless world, the sun barely cleared the horizon before vanishing again like a nervous turtle. Without clocks or consistent daylight, the whole pace of life just completely slowed down. They didn't schedule time, they just kind of felt it. They knew it was time to move based on, the twitchiness of the goats or the depth of the glowing embers in the hearth. In this environment of immense sensory deprivation, they had to actively prevent their brains from essentially chewing on themselves. So what did they do? They kept their hands busy. Even in the dimmest firelight, every single person was engaged in tactile chores, whittling wood, weaving heavy fabrics, or mending fishing nets. These endless tasks were absolutely vital. They kept the fire of the mind alive during that suffocating stretch of the long dark.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how they elevated these daily chores using what we call memory songs. These were simple, repetitive melodies specifically used to help memorize complex tasks. It's a total genius system, really. They seamlessly combined rhythm, mundane chores, and vital education. They effectively turned daily labor into this engaging, music-based survival training program for the entire family.
And when those chores were finally done, the storytelling began. The hearth transformed into both the theater and the temple of the longhouse. Tales of Loki's tricks and Thor's mighty hammer echoed against the soot-stained rafters. These stories did something absolutely crucial. They filled the empty, echoing silence of the Arctic night. They transformed the claustrophobic darkness into a world that felt rich and full and completely alive with mythology.
Section 4, Winter Magic and the Dream World.
As the winter dragged on and the outside world just disappeared into white, the atmosphere inside became deeply ethereal, almost meditative. To the people enduring the siege, the veil between the physical world and the unseen spiritual realms began to feel incredibly thin. In this extreme isolation, they engaged in beautiful, quiet rituals to connect with the unseen. They would carve protective runes deep into the heavy roof beams. They'd leave small bowls of milk near the doorway for the hidden ones, the house spirits they fully believed shared their shelter. They even slept in specific, deliberate positions just to invite visions. In this sensory deprivation, they believed the dead came whispering, and dreams essentially became a very vivid second life.
And outside, the magic was just as palpable. When they did step out into that featureless white void, they looked up to the northern lights. They marveled at what they believed was the literal breath of the gods, or maybe the shimmering reflection of Valkyrie shields dancing in the dark. On a practical level, they used the stars above as a crucial celestial map, navigating by the constellations to find their buried food stores when the ground offered absolutely zero landmarks.
Finally, Section 5, the spring thaw, the return of life.
But eventually, the moment they had been enduring the entire siege for finally arrives. Imagine the profound sensory relief when that howling wind finally changes direction. You begin to hear the very first soft drips of melting water from the eaves. You smell the fresh, sharp scent of wet mud and thawing grass. It was this quiet pulse of life returning, signaling the end of winter's long, dark tyranny. Which brings us to the core takeaway of this entire survival strategy. The longhouse breathed like a single organism, slow, incredibly stubborn, and completely dedicated to protecting its inhabitants until the sun finally returned. Survival in this harsh era was never just about trapping physical heat. It was about harmony between humans and animals, the sheer strength of a tight-knit community, and the unbroken resilience of human thought.
So I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought. If you were stripped of your modern comforts, your digital distractions, your instant central heating, could you survive the siege of the long dark? Next time you easily turn up your thermostat, take a moment to reflect on your own resilience. Remember those ancient, incredible survival instincts that are literally still pulsing in your blood.